David Lennox. That was the name of this marshal, sent by the government to deliver the court summons to the whiskey tax evaders. He'd been in the saddle and on the road since May. And now with July half gone, he still had papers left. Not to say things hadn't gone well so far. He'd met with no tarring and feathering such as poor Johnson and the other tax collectors had suffered. He was crossing into Allegheny County now, a stronghold of the Mingo Creek men. His guide was soon to join him. In every territory Lennox had passed through, he had left a wake of anguish. One look at those court summons, and the farmers knew they were ruined. The court was all the way over in Philadelphia, across the mountain wilds of the Appalachians. With our speedy, cost-effective methods of travel that we have today, it's easy to forget what this meant to the backcountry people of 1794. To get to Philadelphia was a long and costly trip. Not to mention, court trials could take a while, and you had to fend for yourself in the town while you waited it out. This was all going to take time and money that these farmers simply didn't have. They had crops to tend to, families to care for. But to ignore a court summons might mean fines, or even imprisonment. What on earth were they going to do? Thing is, the farmers weren't actually supposed to come all the way to Philadelphia. You see, there was a representative of Pennsylvania in Congress named William Finley, and Finley actually cared about the people he was chosen to represent. When he heard about the court summons that were going to be given to the farmers, he was not happy. He knew what it meant to them to travel so far, and he didn't feel it was right. He suspected that Hamilton had done this on purpose, just to make the farmers rise up and rebel. Then he could feel justified about crushing them with military power. Finley fought to get the summons changed, so that the trials could be held in the local backcountry courts instead of the big one in Philadelphia. He got his wish, but not till July. It was too late to get word to Lennox. If Lennox knew about the suffering he was causing, he didn't care much. He was just doing his job. Besides, these men were lawbreakers. They deserved to pay for their crimes. His guide appeared on the dusty road before him now. His guide, who was none other than the federal tax inspector for the state, the infamous General John Neville. The two cantered on together, side by side, no doubt chatting about the pestilent little gang that had been such a bother in these parts. Neville was probably feeling rather smug. Now the Mingo Creek men were going to get it. He'd show them for shutting down his tax office. They had a federal marshal to deal with now. The pair was passing Oliver Miller's farm when Gunshot startled both them and their horses, and balls of lead went whizzing overhead. Tom the Tinker's welcome. Neville and Lennox suddenly decided that a stroll through the back roads maybe wasn't such a lovely proposition after all. In fact, Neville felt very much like he should be going home. He galloped away to his big fancy house called Bower Hill. Lennox beat it to Pittsburgh. Thanks to their committee of correspondence, the Mingo Creek men knew exactly who Lennox was. And of course, they already knew Neville too well. Problem was, they didn't know that Lennox had gone to Pittsburgh. They assumed that he had gone off with Neville. Next day, Bower Hill was surrounded by 30 men with loaded guns. "Bring out the marshal," they demanded, when Neville asked what they wanted. Neville didn't tell them anything one way or the other. Anything with words or sense, that is. Instead, he took a shot at Oliver Miller, dropping him mortally wounded to the ground. Well, if you're familiar with the Scots-Irish temperament, you'll know the Mingo Creek fellows didn't take so well to this kind of behavior. They turned their rifles on the mansion and let loose. Once the flames of fury had died a bit, though, it became obvious they weren't going to take a strong place like this with just a handful of men. And Neville had his slaves helping fire on them from inside, too. They drew back to a nearby fort and sent a summons to the other gang members in the area. It was 600 men who returned to Bower Hill the next day. Not a rabble or a mob, but a militia under the able command of James McFarlane. Major James McFarlane, to be exact. A veteran of the War for Independence. Neville had got reinforcements too. 10 government troops under the command of Major Abraham Kirkpatrick, who conveniently happened to be Neville's brother-in-law. Lennox and Neville's son, Presley, had galloped over from Pittsburgh to try to help, but they had come too late and ended up being captured by the rebel forces surrounding the house. Funny thing is, Neville himself actually wasn't present. Kirkpatrick, fearing for the general's safety, had sent him out the back door the night before. He spent the ensuing battle cowering in a ravine. As any decent men will do, the women and children were first allowed to leave the area and go to a place of safety. Then, it was war. The rattle of musket fire echoed across the hilly woodlands for miles around, and the haze of gunpowder smoke rose to create the battle atmosphere so familiar to these revolutionary veterans. This was kept up for the space of an hour, until McFarlane called to his men to hold. And this is where we come to one of those tricky things of history. Some say that McFarlane had seen a white flag flying from one of the windows, and thought they were ready to surrender. Some say there was no white flag, and that McFarlane simply wanted to talk to the enemy. Whatever the case, what followed was undebatable. The shooting stopped, and McFarlane stepped out into the open. He raised his hand to speak. Another gunshot ripped through the silence, and he dropped. The bullet had pierced his brave heart. From the front. If the rage caused by the death of Miller had been frightening, the reaction here was nothing in comparison. McFarlane's men threw aside all personal caution and surged forward to avenge the murder of their commander. The whole of Bower Hill and all of its outbuildings were soon enveloped in flames. Kirkpatrick had no choice but to surrender. Everyone in the house was allowed to leave in peace, except for him. He was made a prisoner, along with Presley, Neville, and Lennox, who, you remember, had been taken before the fighting started. Eventually, the three of them managed to escape. Despite the violence, there was surprisingly little death in the skirmish at Bower Hill. Miller, McFarlane, and one other man lost their lives on the rebel side, while only one soldier perished defending the house. But the first shots had been fired, nonetheless, and the blood of Miller and McFarlane cried out from the earth.